Henrik Ibsen was a playwright born in Norway in 1828 who was among the most popular of the 19th century. He is often considered the father of modern drama and is today known as the second most performed dramatist in the world, only after William Shakespeare. He is also known as the most renowned Norwegian writer of all time and the most famous Norwegian internationally. Ibsen's most famous and influential works include A Doll's House, The Wild Duck, Rosmersholm, and the subject of this video, Ghosts. The events and reception of A Doll's House in particular are relevant to the subject today. Published in 1879, it was Ibsen's first work to become popular outside of Scandinavia and is considered by multiple historians as the precise moment when modern drama began. It was extremely controversial on release due to its depiction of a woman, Nora, leaving her seemingly comfortable home, husband, and children behind to discover herself. One of Ibsen's biographers, Michael Meyer, said that no play before had ever contributed so momentously to the social debate or been so widely and furiously discussed among people who were not normally interested in theatrical or even artistic matter. The show was absolutely groundbreaking. It was the first widely performed play to seriously discuss women's liberation and gender equality, and Nora had been described as the richest, most complex female dramatic character since Shakespeare. And it was coming off of the release of A Doll's House that Ibsen decided to write Ghosts. He said that it was an absolute necessity, and that after Nora, Mrs. Alving had to come. He intended Mrs. Alving's character in Ghosts to be the bad ending for Nora, what would have happened if she decided to stay with her husband. With that established, we can get into the events of Ghosts. Actually, quick side note, Ghosts is a questionable translation of the original Danish title. Ibsen titled the play Gengangave. I'm sorry, I do not speak a word of Danish. That was my best attempt. It does mean ghosts, but it does also have a second meaning, again walkers, or ones who return. For this reason, Ibsen actually preferred the title revenants in English. It's not a common term. A lot of critics have described it as too complicated or too French. But it does accurately capture the original double meaning of the title. With that side note established, we can get into the events of Ghosts. And I am going to keep calling it that. It was published in 1881, and it takes place in contemporary rural Norway at the family home of Mrs. Helene Alving, a widow. We're first introduced to her maid, Regina Engstrand, and her so called father, Jacob, who is drunk and has just entered through the window of a home that he does not live in. They fight, mean words are exchanged, and Jacob tries to convince Regina to work as a dancer in the club for sailors that he wants to build, but she is not interested. She kicks him out, and then enters Pastor Manders to meet with Mrs. Alving. There's some tension when the two of them meet because Manders notices that she's been reading about women's rights. She defends herself, saying that most people agree with it these days. Manders, after commenting that he's never read anything of the sort and he forms his opinions exclusively based on what others are saying, he settles on, I wouldn't disapprove of you acquainting yourself with what the so called intellectuals are thinking, the sort of world that your son's straight into, but don't talk about it. You don't have to make your views public. Mrs. Alving agrees, and, having reached tentative peace, the two move to discussing the business of a new orphanage that Helene is funding for the church to build and operate and to be dedicated to the late Mr. Alving. All of the paperwork is in order, but a decision needs to be made about whether to insure the property or not. Mrs. Alving is set on insuring it. Of course, none of them would have the money to rebuild it if anything were to happen. Manders, however, insists that it would seem unfaithful to insure it, that because the orphanage is God's property, then it must be under God's protection, and that insuring it would be betting against God's will. Neither of them are comfortable with this decision, which is an interesting lack of faith from the man who is so concerned about seeming unfaithful. But Helene decides that Manders must know best, and she decides to not insure the orphanage. Enter Oswald, Helene's son, a painter who has been living abroad since she sent him away as a child, who has been visiting home for some time now. He banters with Manders about the corruption of the art world, until Manders says that Oswald has never lived in a proper home, a house where a man lives with his wife and his family. To which Oswald replies, or with his children and their mother. This sparks a heated argument about free love, of which Oswald is a proponent and Manders is vehemently against. Manders rails against living in sin, and Oswald counters that he's seen far more immoral behaviors from outsiders looking in on his bohemian community than he ever sees from its members. He steps away from the argument for some fresh air, and Helene takes her chance to tell Manders that she agrees with every single word. This provokes a much more heated argument between Helene and Manders when Manders brings up the fact that Helene left her husband after 1 year of marriage. She tells him the marriage was unhappy, and he responds, "We don't have the right to expect happiness. We have a duty on this earth, and yours was to love, honor, and obey the man that you had married." It's revealed that after she left him the first time, she went to Manders directly, and he convinced her to go back. He tells her that she is too governed by her desires, that she abandoned her marriage, and that she sent her son away when she was bored with them, and tells her that she can make it right now by saving Oswald from this immorality. Helene is, understandably, filled with the kind of rage that can only be expressed in the coolest, most collected voice imaginable. She decides to tell Manders the whole story. She tells him of an abusive, alcoholic, debaucherous man mistreating her and Oswald and what she had to do to survive. She worked tirelessly to make sure that no one would ever realize that the father of her son was a drunk and a leech. She tells about how he would get drunk and sleep with other women, how to keep him home she had to drink with him and listen to stories of his sexual exploits, how he would get violent and she would have to wrestle him to bed. He even once slept with their maid while she was in the house, and he got her pregnant. That was the last straw for Helene. She sent Oswald away at age 7 and would not let him return while his father was still alive. She took control of all the household affairs, and she worked as hard as she could to keep herself going. She saved up her own money and reveals that she is funding the orphanage to ensure that all of Mr. Alving's money goes to that, and that all of the money that Oswald will inherit will be from her. The second act of the play starts with another conversation between Manders and Helene. They've overheard Oswald and Regina flirting in the other room, and it's revealed that Regina is secretly and unknowingly one of Alving's illegitimate children, making her Oswald's half sister. In a tense moment, she says to him that if she had the courage, she would tell Oswald everything about his father, but she's too much of a coward. Manders tells her that a child should honor their father and mother, that Oswald idealizes his father, and that it's better to give him something to believe in, even if that's a lie. She tells Manders about the titular ghosts in her life that she really fears. The things that come out of the past, not just the people that haunt us, but what we inherit from our parents. Dead ideas, dead customs, dead morals. Manders is then summoned to prepare for a service at the orphanage, noting that he will need some candles, and leaves Oswald and Helene alone. Oswald sits Helene down and reveals to her that he's come down with an illness. He says that he has never lived it up, never drank too much, was never too promiscuous, but a doctor told him, "Since you were born, you've been vermoulu," meaning worm-eaten. He was told that it's a hereditary illness, that the sins of the fathers are visited on their children. It's not the clearest to a modern audience, but what Oswald is describing here is being diagnosed with congenital syphilis. We'll get into the plausibility of that later, but for now we can just take it as a fact that Mr. Alving passed syphilis to Oswald and he's been infected since birth. Oswald was enraged at the doctor suggesting that his father could ever contract a venereal disease, and the doctor tells him that if that's the case, then it must be Oswald's fault. And he's been living with that guilt ever since. The two start drinking and discussing Regina. Oswald goes on and on about how beautiful she is and reveals that he actually promised to take her back to Paris with him. When she returns, Oswald asks her to sit down and drink with them, and he explains that people here in Norway just don't know how to enjoy life, that if he had to stay here, that all the beauty in his work would just slide into ugliness. Suddenly, Manders arrives. Oswald tells everyone that he will be taking Regina to live with him in Paris and that they might even get married, and Helene stops them to tell them something very important. But before she can say anything, there's shouting outside the window, and everyone notices that the orphanage, which remember was left uninsured, is on fire. Several hours later, the fire is under control and the orphanage is beyond repair. Jacob comes bursting into the house to inform everyone that Manders had to have been the one to cause the fire, that he was giving a blessing with candles, and that he saw him pinch the wick of a candle and throw it down into the wood shavings, eventually setting the whole building ablaze. Helene is actually not that upset about the situation. The money that she needed to get rid of is gone anyway, so it's unfortunate that the orphanage burned down, but she got what she needed done. Jacob has a bit of a quid pro quo here with Manders. He agrees to not tell anyone that Manders set the fire, and in exchange, Manders will let him use the land that the orphanage used to take up to build his club for sailors. And at that point, both of them leave, leaving just Helene, Oswald, and Regina to discuss. Helene tells them both that Mr. Alving was a good man forced into a bad situation, and that she wasn't able to bring enough joy into his life until he looked elsewhere for consolation. She says to Oswald, I think I destroyed your father before you were born. And I think, that Regina has just as much a right to this house as you do. In that moment, Regina realizes her true parentage, that her mother was a tart, and she leaves them behind. She goes back to catch Manders, saying that even if she had to go back to work with Jacob at the Sailor's Refuge, that it would be better than this. And finally, it's just Helene and Oswald. She asked him if he's shocked about his father, and he just says that it's all the same to me. That the concept of loving your parents just because they're your parents is one of those old sayings that sticks around, another one of those ghosts. In the final exchange of the play, Oswald explains the state of his condition, that he had an episode in Paris before coming home, and that he knows it's going to happen again. He shows Helene a box of 12 morphine pills, enough for an overdose, and asks her to, if he has another episode, put him out of his misery. She at first fights him on it, saying that she could never help her own son kill himself, but with a bit of discussion, she's convinced, saying that she'll do it if she has to. The play ends with Oswald slipping into another episode, at which point Helene pulls out the box, contemplates her choice, and the stage is enveloped in a bright white light before she can make her final decision. That was, perhaps, a long-winded explanation of the plot, but I do intend to get into some pretty specific details, and I want to make sure that the important points are fleshed out. At this point, I'd like to talk about some broader trends of specifically European theater history to contextualize when this play was coming out and why it got the public reaction that it did. Spoiler alert, it was extremely controversial, but we'll get into that after the history. We'll start with a brief overview of the English Civil Wars. I know! I'll make it brief. In 1642, King Charles I of England was beefing with Parliament, which was largely controlled by Puritans at the time. They fought a bunch, and eventually they established the English Commonwealth, led by Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector, thing which I totally promise is different from a king. He ruled until the end of his life, and then his son, who took over, was a terrible king. I mean, Lord Protector. So Parliament voted to bring the old guy's son back, who was currently hiding in France, and things eventually went back to normal under King Charles II. During the Puritans' 18 years of rule, though, things did get pretty wacky. In an attempt to exercise all possible means to appease and avert the wrath of God at the outset of the war, a public order was issued to halt performance of all public stage plays in London while these sad causes and set times of humiliation do continue, and that the people should instead participate in the profitable and seasonable considerations of repentance, reconciliation, and peace with God. That spirit would carry through the remainder of the Commonwealth period, while public performances remained illegal. Underground theater still existed in the form of so-called pamphlet plays, which largely consisted of half-baked political commentary and fart jokes. Still, that was genuinely subversive at the time, and it would shape the theater of the following Restoration period. So, it's 1660, Charles II is back on the throne, and now all of these fart joke plays can be performed in public. Yippee! The repression and censorship of the Commonwealth period sought to keep everyone's minds pure and holy, but really it just built an even stronger fascination with the taboo and the obscene, particularly in the theater world. Everyone wants to talk about sex, irreverence, and general debauchery, and everyone hates the Puritans. And that's how they got to America. They bounced back so hard that King James II, Charles II's son, was so offended that he issued a solemn proclamation against vice and profaneness, which specifically fined a few popular writers, actresses, and actresses of the time. But they kept performing anyway, and this was the start of the world of theater that would eventually spawn Ibsen's work. Now we get into the public response to Ghosts. The show was very controversial when it came out. I mean, it was 1881, and Ghosts covers blasphemy, incest, women's rights, free love, abuse, alcoholism, syphilis, euthanasia, and more. Still, Ibsen published the play in Copenhagen in 1881. He printed 10,000 copies. Most of them didn't sell, and then like half of the ones that did got returned anyway. They didn't need to print any more of them until 1894. They sent it out to a bunch of major theaters all across Scandinavia. None of them would stage it. Ultimately, the first performance was in 1882 at the Aurora Turner Hall in Chicago, Illinois. It was performed in Danish, primarily for Scandinavian immigrants, and it did extremely well. It got tons of positive reviews, and eventually it got performed all across Europe, despite the initial backlash, just a couple of years later. He knew that his play was going to be controversial. He wrote to the publisher shortly before the initial release, saying, Ghosts will probably cause alarm in some circles, but it can't be helped. If it did not, there would have been no necessity for me to have written it. He very strongly felt that the topics covered in Ghosts needed to be amplified in the public consciousness, particularly after the public reception of Doll's House got a few years earlier. To put it plainly, Ibsen wrote about a woman leaving her husband, and it was so controversial that he decided, hey, I'm going to show them just how much worse it would be if she didn't. It was controversial. A lot of people weren't ready to hear it, but many embraced it. A Doll's House and Ghosts were both common subjects of conversation all across Europe, dinner table all over, and it was so popular that there are literal records of dinner party guests being specifically told to not talk about Ibsen's plays. Now we can get into some more in depth analysis on some of these themes, and we're going to start with religion. One of the key moments of suspense in the play is the question of the orphanage's insurance. Pastor Manders insists that it would seem unfaithful to insure it, that they should just trust God's protection. Helene is obviously uncomfortable with this, but she's willing to capitulate to maintain her, and mostly Manders' public image. The interesting thing is that Manders doesn't even trust God to protect it. The pastor who's so concerned about seeming faithful doesn't even have that faith in his own teachings. There's something of a poetic irony to Manders, against his own better judgment, insisting on leaving the orphanage uninsured, and then he himself being the one to set the fire to destroy it. Of course, that's not even considering the possibility that he may have intended to burn it down the whole time, but we don't actually have time to get into that one. The big religious theme in the show, in my opinion, is Helene questioning her religion. Indeed, this was one of the most controversial parts at the time of release. Norway was, and actually still is, an officially Lutheran country, and at the time the public's values very much fit those conservative religious standards. Anyone who was not Christian, wasn't Christian enough, questioned their Christianity, or just did anything that was too sinful was considered evil and must be of the devil. And Helene is pretty direct in her scorning of religion. She presents real arguments for her position, but she also shouts things like, God and the law, there you have the cause of all the misery in the world, in an argument with Manders. Helene was a victim of abuse. She tried to leave her husband. She went to her priest for help, and she was told that she had a duty to God to return and just tough it out. And she did. She listened, she went back, she suffered through it for even longer. She sent her son away, and she did everything she could to keep herself going. But still, Manders and the rest of the religious folk can never look past the fact that she left her God ordained marriage. That no matter how bad it was for her, a woman has a duty to her husband. So says the Lord, and that's the end of it. So, understandably, Helene starts questioning her faith. And in her own words, she picked at the knot, and when it was undone, the whole thing unraveled, and she instantly realized the whole thing was fake. She realized that religion brought her nothing but misery, and she did away with it. This is a pretty normal thing to see in the modern day. Hell, I went through the same experience myself a few years ago, but in the 1880s, this was just blasphemy. A few years earlier, or in a less progressive part of the world, just writing this could have gotten Ibsen executed. But this was the play that he wrote, and this was the message that he so desperately wanted people to see. Incest is another theme in the story that pushes the audience's comfort zone. Oswald and Regina are half siblings, but they have absolutely no idea when they start flirting. This reveal is, of course, meant to be shocking to the audience and still plays that way today. Incest hasn't exactly gotten less taboo since then. Manders and Helene notice them together, knowing that they are in fact half siblings, and they argue about what to do with it. Manders wants to tell them and break them up immediately, but Helene says something interesting. She says that she doesn't like the two of them being together, but that if they both want it, then she wants to encourage it. She says that it's hardly unique round here. Manders is outraged, and she responds, I thought we were all descended from such relationships. Wasn't that God's design, Pastor? She calls out a hypocrisy in Manders' worldview. If all of us are descended from Adam and Eve, then we're all children of incest far enough back. What's so wrong with doing it now? It's a shocking argument, but it does raise genuine questions about Christian doctrine and about how we should question our predispositions about the things we see as taboo. With incest, it may be justified, but there are plenty of other things that we have a knee jerk negative reaction to that are not inherently wrong at all, and we need to honestly examine those. Alcoholism is a point that comes up a few times in the show. Both of the men who are particularly abusive figures, Jacob and Mr. Alving, are shown to be violent drunks. This is, in my opinion, done more so to establish the character's aggressive personality than to make any particular social commentary on alcoholism. The abusive alcoholic father is a common trope for a reason. It's been culturally relevant pretty much as long as alcohol has been around, and I don't really think there's that much more to it in this case. Ibsen thinks alcoholism bad. A more concrete scene of abuse that I would like to talk about is the pipe scene with Oswald and his father. I skipped over it earlier as it isn't relevant to the major beats of the story, but I'll summarize. Oswald walks into Helene and Mander's conversation during scene 1 smoking a pipe. Helene asks him to stop, and he mentions that he smoked it once with his father when he was little. Helene denies this, but he recounts the story as he remembers it. He sat me down on his lap, and he gave me his pipe to smoke. Go on, smoke it. There's a good lad. That's what he said. And I puffed and puffed until I started to sweat and go the color of parchment, and he roared with laughter. Helene cuts in and says that he must have dreamt that, to which Oswald responds, No, I didn't, Mama. You came in. Don't you remember? You came in and you carried me back to the nursery, and I was feeling sick and you were crying. Did he like playing practical jokes? Later in the play, Oswald confesses that he doesn't remember anything else about his father, just that one memory before his mother sent him away. There has been a great deal of debate over the exact meaning of this scene, primarily whether it's meant to be taken literally. The event, as described, is definitely abusive and is conceivably something that a narcissistic parent might put their child through for their own amusement. And it's possible that that's all that's happening here. But the other main interpretation is seeing this as a metaphor for sexual abuse. Based on the fact that Oswald's memories are hazy and his recollection of his mother crying while carrying him away, it's entirely possible that this was intended to be a child's mind making sense of a traumatic experience, filling in the memories with something less horrific. The main technical justification I've seen for it is that it would explain how both Alving and Oswald were infected with syphilis, but Helene and Regina seem not to be. Rather than it being congenital, as the doctor described, Oswald could have been infected by being raped by his father at a young age. And now, for the section everyone's been eagerly awaiting, syphilis. There's been a lot of debate over the exact nature of Oswald's condition, perhaps more so than any other specific detail in the play. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease, primarily spread through sex, but it can also be passed from a mother to a child when they're born. In that case, it's known as congenital syphilis. The main issue of interpretation is that Oswald is diagnosed with congenital syphilis specifically. The doctor tells him that it was from the sins of the father and not from his own actions. The problem with this is that, as I mentioned earlier, Alvin and Oswald are both symptomatic, but Helene and Regina seem to be perfectly healthy. There are a few possible interpretations for this. One is that the doctor is completely correct. Oswald has been infected since birth, and Helene is infected but has remained asymptomatic so far. That is completely possible. Syphilis has been known to lay dormant for as long as 20 years, and that would also mean that Regina is probably also infected and asymptomatic, as Alvin would have spread it to her mother as well, and her mother would have passed it to her at birth. The other, much darker interpretation goes back to the pipe scene I mentioned earlier. If we assume the doctor's wrong, Helene was never infected, nor was Regina's mother. Neither Oswald nor Regina is born syphilitic, but at a young age, Mr. Alving raped his son and spread the syphilis to him. It's a horrifying prospect, but it is another interpretation that could explain why Oswald was infected, but his mother seemingly wasn't. Both of those interpretations are, however, based on a modern understanding of the disease. We need to consider that Ibsen was writing this in the 1880s. He was a very well educated and well read man. He was up to date on the contemporary understanding of the disease, but it does happen to be that the medical world was pretty incorrect about a few things about syphilis at the time. At the time, it was thought that there were four different ways of contracting it, each of which had different symptoms. The first is traditional sexual transmission, and the other three are all congenital. It could either be contracted from just the mother being infected, from both parents being infected, or in rare cases, from just the father being infected. That last case doesn't make much sense according to a modern understanding, but it was believed that it was completely possible for a father to pass congenital syphilis to a child without infecting the mother. Now, any observed cases of this were almost certainly due to the mother remaining asymptomatic, but Ibsen was writing from a contemporary understanding. Congenital syphilis, contracted from the mother, was thought to be both much more common and much more lethal, whereas those infected by purely paternal transmission were considered much more likely to live into adulthood, though they were thought to inherit an influence of vital decline, caducity, and degeneracy. The fact that Oswald remained asymptomatic throughout childhood, that he survived to adulthood, and the specifics of his symptoms would imply that Ibsen intended this to be a case of solely paternal transmission without infecting Helene. It is worth mentioning, at least offhand, that Alving definitely knew he had syphilis, and he definitely kept having sex, at least with Helene, but almost certainly with other women too. What a awful guy. The end of the play is probably the most impactful and emotionally tense part of the show. Helene finally realizes that her son, Oswald, is the only thing she has left, the only thing that will make her happy, and she wants to dedicate herself to caring for him. Oswald tells her how much she's suffering and asks her to put him out of his misery. He tells her that he doesn't want to turn into a gray haired infant and says, can my mother, bear to watch her son in pain? After a tense moment of deliberation, she tells him that she will help him overdose if she has to. He thanks her, and then just a few lines later, he begins to slip into another episode. He begs Helene for the pills. She tells him no 3 times while pilling them out and examining them. She looks at them in her hand, deliberating if she should give them to him, and before she can make her choice, the stage is enveloped in a white light and the play ends. I can only imagine the things that would be going through Helene's head at that moment. She loves her son, and she knows that he's the one thing she had left. And she is absolutely terrified of losing him. But Oswald is suffering, and he told her that what he wants is to be put out of it now while he's still all there. She loves him, she wants him to be happy. Even beyond the conflicts between their desires, there's the social stigma of it. Euthanasia is highly controversial today, let alone 150 years ago. What would people say about her? The woman who left her husband, allowed the orphanage that she spent all of his money on to burn down, and then helped her own son kill himself? What kind of a woman does that? But again, she loves her son, and she needs to do what's best for him. I really like the deliberate ambiguity in the ending. I really think it adds so much to the story not knowing what she chose. It forces the audience to sit and consider what they would do in her situation. It makes them think empathetically about it, rather than just having a knee jerk, horrified reaction to the concept of assisted suicide. I think that was woefully needed at the time, and I think it's still extremely impactful to this day. Ghosts, as well as Ibsen's work more broadly, have influenced so much in the world of modern theater that it is almost impossible to imagine what it would even look like without it. There is very much a reason why Ibsen is called the father of modern drama, and that A Doll's House is considered the play that began the age of modern theater. His work would go on to influence great playwrights and novelists, including George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, and plenty more. The critical reception to Ghosts in particular led to a rise of a new kind of theater in Europe. Though the major playhouses refused to stage Ibsen's work due to its controversy, the demand to see Ghosts and the other so called obscene plays was ever present. The theater world responded with the establishment of the independent theater movement, a group of theaters that would stage plays that major theaters wouldn't show. The most significant of these companies included the Independent Theatre Society in London, Le Théâtre Libre in Paris, and Die Freie Bühne in Berlin, the latter of which first opened with a performance of Ghosts. And with that, here are my sources. That turned out being so much longer than I expected. I think we're at about 40 minutes on the take. We'll see how long that ends up being when we cut it down. Yeah, 40, 45. Let's go. This is 8 pages of script, and I was worried I wasn't going to hit 30 minutes, and let me tell you, I think I'm going to. And now, as your reward for sitting through that entire video, here are all of the times that I fucked up. Alright, I think this is take 5. We got that ancient webcam. It's actually a fine enough webcam, but I tried using my phone and it actually ended up overheating and shutting down mid-take. So, back on the webcam, it's really low quality, max 720p. I am so goddamn exhausted, and now we're going to record it. I finished writing this morning. My script is 8.5 pages long. Here we go. Fuck. Oh boy, that took 10 fucking minutes to summarize. Anyone who was not Christian, wasn't Christian enough, questioned their Christianity, questioned. We're on page 4. Okay. Yeah. But this is the play that he wrote, and this is the message that he so desperately wanted people to see. He sat me down on his lap. Oh, I didn't specify. He's talking about his father. He smoked it once with his father when he was little. Alving and Oswald are both symptomatic. The fact that Oswald remained asymptomatic, his work would go on to influence great playwrights and novelists, including George Bernard Shaw. Oh my fucking god. Including George Bernard Shaw, Oscar Wilde. Oscar? I just got off of an 8-hour shift at the fucking gas station. Jesus Christ.